Well, it looks like we have enough people in to get started. So, hello, everybody. We're so glad to have you here for today's program. My name is Shay Quarry, and I serve as the programs manager for the DC Preservation League. I'm joined today by our presenters, Frank Leon and Denise Vogt, and by my coworker, Zachary Burt, who is running the live stream on Facebook. For those of you who may be new to DCPL, we are Washington, D.C.'s citywide nonprofit founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic built environment of the nation's capital. I have just a few things to go over today before we get started. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors, whose annual financial support helps underwrite free programs like this one today. They are the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, QTAC Rock, Douglas Development Corporation, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Intunovich Associates, Buyer Blender Bell, EHT Traceries Inc., and KCE Structural Engineers. Thank you all for your dedication to historic preservation in DC. So moving on, just a few notes on how today's webinar will work. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen to submit those questions, and we'll go through those towards the end of the program. The chat won't be turned on for participants until the end of the program, since it can be distracting to our presenters, but it will be on for you to chat at the end of the program. For those joining us on Facebook, Zach will be monitoring any questions that you have. You can submit those in the comments section, and he will send those to us over here on Zoom. So now that we've covered that, I'm so pleased to introduce you all to today's speakers. Frank Leon and Denise Vogt reside in the Foggy Bottom Historic District and are co-founders and co-chairs of the Foggy Bottom Association History Project. Frank and Denise recently co-edited chapters on Foggy Bottom and the White House neighborhoods for the 6th edition of Washington on Foot. Frank authors the Funkstown History blog, is a licensed tour guide, and serves on the Board of Trustees of the DC History Center and on the DC Preservation League committees on landmarks and historic districts. Denise is a recent member of the Foggy Bottom Association Board and serves on the DC History Center's Community Council. We're so excited to have them here today, and they are definitely great friends of DCPL, so we're excited to have them share their work and be able to hear more about their project. So I'll hand it over to you all, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all the great work that the DC Preservation League does, and including these programs, but all the other work in the trenches that you all do as well. So we're going to talk about Foggy Bottom, and we'll introduce you to where that is in a minute. But it's a microcosm of DC history in many ways. We've had industry, immigration, alleys, development, and some aspects of all of that are preserved in our little 4-block historic district. So first, we'd like to give a brief overview of the history of Foggy Bottom, and then go through a project that we've set up. It's an innovative map that will allow you to basically click on a house and find out more information about it. And so we'll go through that, and we'll talk about a couple of families who resided in Foggy Bottom over time. So Foggy Bottom is it's not a written official designated area, but informally it's the area from 17th Street to the river in Rock Creek, from Constitution Avenue up to Pennsylvania Avenue, and includes in the middle a lot of what is now George Washington University. The little red star marks the historic district, which is actually part of 4 blocks right off of southwest of Washington Circle. So starting from the beginning, this area was inhabited by Native Americans, as was the rest of the city by the Anacostan and the Nacotchtank tribes. And during the construction of Whitehurst Freeway renovations in the 90s, NPS did some excavations and found a tomb from 750 AD, which included some grave goods, which are shown up here on this slide. They also found pottery that went back 5,000 years. So the area has a long history. Then it, of course, was settled in the 1600s. There were small farms there, and the map we have here is from 1792. And one of the interesting things is there is actually a town that was laid out. It's called Hamburg. It was developed by Jacob Funk, who came from Pennsylvania, although his ancestors came from Europe. And so it's also known as Funkstown. And you can see on this slide there you go, pointer sort of works. This is how it was laid out in 1765. So it was supposed to be a new town, and it had an area for a church and a town square and all of this. This is before, of course, Washington became the national capital. But it didn't really take off. It, like Washington, was slow in developing, except for it was even slower, and it never really developed. And then the federal government purchased the land and obtained the property for the new nation's capital. But the name Funkstown lives on in the history blog that I do. So Foggy Bottom is unusual. It's not unique that we had Georgetown, we had Navy Yard that also had industries, but George Washington anticipated the new capital being a big commercial city, and that never happened for a variety of reasons. Mostly lack of support for Congress that wasn't interested in developing alternative places of commerce. But Foggy Bottom did have its early industries, and here we show the old glass house. It was located on what is now Constitution Avenue, what was then the waterfront. And it started in 1807, ran till about 1840. A lot of German glass workers, also enslaved people, worked there. They blew the glass and then flattened it to make windows, which they then sold all over the country. We also had lime kilns. Lime kiln, you heat this limestone and get lime, which is used in mortar and plaster. And there were a number of lime kilns in DC. We still have, I don't know if they're elsewhere in the city, but here we still have remnants that are shown here. And this is located right off of Rock Creek Parkway by the Whitehorse Freeway. So you've probably gone by it a million times, and that's what that is. Foggy Bottom's most celebrated industry is breweries. We had the city's first brewery in 1792. That could be a presentation in itself. But the best known was one of the largest in DC, the Christian Heinrich Brewery, that was in place from 1896, when it moved down from DuPont Circle, to 1956. And then it went out of business, and the land is now used for the Kennedy Center. Of course, if you go up New Hampshire Avenue, you can see Christian Heinrich's mansion, and there's a wonderful museum there, and learn more about his life. But his brewery was in Foggy Bottom. The Foggy Bottom's least celebrated industry is probably the Washington Gas Works. They brought coal from the Western Maryland coal fields down the C&O Canal, and then went into these huge furnaces where the coal was heated, gave off natural gas, gave off manufactured gas, and was used for street lights and gas in DC. So you can imagine it also gave off a lot of soot and smoke. And so Foggy Bottom really got its name because it was a low-lying area along the river, and there was fog, but also it was an industrial area, and so there was smog that was added to it. The gasworks continued in place until the 1940s, and we'll see a couple of other pictures of these huge gas holders that were there. This is Virginia Avenue. So we had these industries, and we had people working in the industries. In the Foggy Bottom area, what is now the historic district, we had African Americans, both free and enslaved, from the very beginning when the properties became occupied. But in the 1870s, we had immigration from Ireland primarily, also from Germany. And so these houses in the historic district, they're mostly two-story, two-bay. They're relatively simple, but they do have some architectural flourishes along the roof line and along the windows. It's all pressed brick. And the people who lived there, many of them were immigrants who worked in the nearby industries. And in fact, some of them were immigrants who built the houses. There's Peter McCartney was an Irish immigrant. He was a carpenter. He basically became a developer and built 6 of the houses in the 1870s and 1880s that we still have in Foggy Bottom. And so those are the houses that remain today and in the historic district. We also had alley dwellings. This is definitely a subject for another seminar. Alleys were an important part of DC housing. They were basically where the poorer people lived, again, first immigrants, and then they became overwhelmingly African American. And they were they raised concerns with the progressive reformers of the time. Basically, they were like the tenements in New York City. It's where the poor people lived. They were overcrowded. There were concerns about crime and immorality, especially because they were hidden. There were also communities that where people cooperated and worked together and helped each other and had basically because the houses were so small and they were overcrowded with roomers, they treated the alleys as big front yards. So there were, by 1890, about 10% of the DC population lived in alleys. There was an effort to get rid of them that went through the 1950s. And right now, there are about 100 or so alley houses, and about 30 are in Foggy Bottom, in Snow's Court and Hughes Mews. And you can see here 1 through 7 Snow's Court, these buildings are still here. This is a view the other way looking down Snow's Court. The houses are here. Over here is a stable, which still exists. Not as a stable anymore, but
The structure.
the brick structure is still there. And you can see looming in the background these huge gas holders that dominated the neighborhood. So it was a very different scene back then. So there were, as I said, mostly Irish Americans, other immigrants, working class people. And then by 1910, 1915, 1920, the neighborhood became increasingly African American. And by 1940, it was overwhelmingly African American. Here's some wooden houses in Hughes Mews, one of the other alleys. These are long gone. When we did this research using some of the resources that we'll talk about, we found that a lot of these little houses were businesses. Basically, every corner was an Irish bar or a grocery store. This house here on I Street in the 1920s was a pastry shop. And this is an ad from the Washington Times in 1920, where the proprietor, Miss Shaw, is saying that bread is a necessity. You should eat good homemade bread, hot rolls, donuts, and cakes every day,
He was onto something.
which is still good advice. So this little two-bay, two-story, by that time, relatively shallow house, it's been expanded as many have through the back, not through the top, different story. But we're also had a lot of uses. And then in Snow's Court, the alley that I mentioned, there was a neighborhood playground that was set up in the 40s through the 50s when the DC city government decided it was not going to provide any support for playgrounds and alleys because it wanted to get rid of alleys. And it did, and we'll talk about that a little. So in the 1950s, there were major changes in the neighborhood. The Washington Gas Works closed down. They started using natural gas, so they didn't need these big gasification plants. And the neighborhood then slowly began to develop. One big impact was the Potomac Freeway. That's sort of outlined here. Basically, it runs from Roosevelt Bridge, which was built in the 60s, cuts in front of the Kennedy Center, and then goes here and hooks up with Whitehurst Freeway. And originally, it was supposed to keep going north and hook up with the inner loop, the highway, the inner beltway, basically, that was supposed to go through the city because the downtown financial and business district was dying. And the way to resolve that was to build a bunch of highways and parking lots to bring people back in the city instead of going to the malls in the suburbs, which of course wouldn't have worked anyway. They went to the malls in the suburbs. And so some of these were built, particularly the Southwest Freeway, which goes by Nationals Park and that area. But that was supposed to hook up here, actually with a tunnel under the Lincoln Memorial, if you can imagine such a thing. So the freeway didn't get completed, but parts of the ramps got built. Here are a couple of ramps that were removed in the 90s. That area is still pretty much of a wasteland. It used to be a community. Our map study area includes, and we'll show you this, not just the 4 blocks, but the 3 blocks between the historic district, which is here, and the river, because there were about 260 households there. There was a school, there were churches, there were grocery stores, and that was all demolished for the freeway. In addition, high rises were built. The building here this is probably about 1960. The building here was the Howard Johnson's across from the Watergate. This empty space here is Watergate and Kennedy Center. This proud-looking building is the People's Life Building, which is now the Saudi Embassy. So you see how we went from those two-story houses that we were talking about, that was this whole area, to major development that's the area now. And so, as I mentioned, there were new structures built. This is Potomac Plaza on Virginia Avenue, which is the first one in 1955. Watergate in the 1960s. Kennedy Center opened in 1971. You might not actually recognize that because that's the original design of the Kennedy Center, which was supposed to be a round clamshell that carried over to the river, which would have been quite beautiful, by the way, and sort of inspired the curves that Luigi Moretti used in the Watergate. But Edward Durrell Stone didn't have enough money for his design, so he built the current Kennedy Center in its rectangular shape, sometimes called the box that the Washington Monument came in. I like it, but it would have been pretty spectacular. And the throughway here you have at the beginning. This is E Street before the highway cut off the Kennedy Center area. And the National Capital Planning Commission is currently in the process of considering plans to deck over that highway, redo the whole area, connect the Kennedy Center with downtown. About every 20 years, they come up with these great ideas that will cost billions. They haven't been able to do it yet, but it would be wonderful. The area really could use some help in that regard. So as the area redeveloped in the 50s, there were some neighbors who were concerned, who wanted to keep these row houses, and they were able to preserve them, but they didn't get official preservation recognition until 1987, when the area became a historic district. And then in many years later, we founded the Foggy Bottom Association to preserve and share the history, not just of the historic district, but the whole Foggy Bottom area. And Denise, would you like to talk about the FBA History Project?
Thank you, Frank. Um, uh, the Foggy Bottom Association, I became a board member, I think about 4 years ago. It was a 3-year term. And at the time, then still now, the president, John George, was asking for someone who might have an interest in expanding the history aspect of the neighborhood. My parents had lived in the Foggy Bottom Historic District for almost 40 years. So I was keen to latch on to this history endeavor. And when we inherited the project, we received sort of like a file, a group of files, I don't know if you could see this, of just miscellaneous paper materials. And Frank and I tried to think about ways to take this limited material we had and expand it to create a more functional way to convey the history of the neighborhood. We developed walking tours using Clio software. We have an arts tour through the area. There's a lot of sculpture and murals available year-round to see, as well as the Arts in Foggy Bottom exhibition, which happens every other year. We have individual walking tours. We have a section on the website that is specifically dedicated to resources, both books and videos and student papers from George Washington University. We also have in-person walking tours and oral histories by one person, in a couple in particular in general, but one is Colbert King, the reporter. And Frank pens each issue of the association's digital newsletter, Funkstown column, which he researches and collects information to share about some aspect, not just of the historic district, but of Foggy Bottom in general. So we've really taken this sort of collection of written documents and turned it into a project that's available worldwide for people to tap into, to contribute to, but really to learn about the area's industrial past, its present now, the people who lived here, the houses that remain. And most recently, with an endeavor with the GW Library, the Gelman Special Collections, we have been able to digitize about, let's see, from 1958 to 2006, the paper copies of the Foggy Bottom newsletter. And it's an interesting read to page through the pages, which are now available to do online. And it really is a walk through history or a read through history to see the things that were important to the community, the neighborhood, what was important in terms of journalism, what was acceptable to print versus what we may or may not print now. But it's a good thing to do on a rainy day. So when we another major aspect of this program, the Foggy Bottom History Project, is developing a way to convey the history and the individual houses in what remains of the historic district. And as Frank mentioned, the part of the district that is now freeways to honor that area and the families and the churches and the people who live there. So using the constraints that we had through the Foggy Bottom Association, we developed this mapping project as well as integrated it with a individual house history section with no pre-existing template to follow. We were really sort of on our own, trying to take a vision that we had and make it become real. And so Frank's going to talk a little bit more about the map and the layers, and then also some of the individual houses that we've and the people who live there that we want to share with everybody.
Yeah, and I want to mention, so make sure I don't forget. So we need to thank the Foggy Bottom Association and Sadie Cornelius, who's the technical person who helped set this up. Brian Kraft of DC, who does the Historic Preservation Office History Quest site and a lot of history mapping, who did all the mapping work for us, and DC History Center, which is hosting the map. When we started, I think we had no idea how complicated this would become, but we're pretty happy with how it turned out. Although it's, Denise mentioned, it's really a continuing effort. So the first thing we have, this is the map, and the background is this. If you're familiar with History Quest, it's the same template, and it shows the ages of the houses in different shades. The area here is the area where I talked about, where the freeway was developed. This is what used to be the Howard Johnsons. And so we're including and populating that area. But there's a number of different resources we can click on to find out more about what's going on in the neighborhood in general, as well as specific houses. And that includes city directories, census data, property records, historic maps, which we can do overlays with, original lots, and then individual house history. So when you come to the site, you can click on layers over here. The layer list pops up, and then you can click on it. This one, for example, just shows our study area and our current buildings. So if we want to focus on a specific house, we can put in the address of the house, or we can just look at the map and click on it. And the one we want to talk about first is at New Hampshire Avenue and I Street, and it's this big yellow house here. And so you can go to that house and click on it, and the History Quest information comes up. And so it'll tell you it was built in 1886. Its original owner was Samuel Normant, and you'll find that he was a developer, and he developed all the houses in that corner plus other houses in the area. The builder was J.H. Grant, who also built it. Sometimes it will also show the purpose. Here it's a dwelling and it's brick. So that gives you the basic information on the house for starters. Then you can look at the historic map overlays. And here, for example, is the 1857 map that is the Botchkey map of the city. And it shows how unpopulated these 4 blocks were at the time. And in fact, the block where our house that was built in 1886, it didn't even exist. There were no houses at that time. So there's several other maps you can scroll through and do overlays and show how it developed. And then this is 1887 Hopkins map. And it shows in that 30-year period, the development of the neighborhood. The red rectangles are brick houses. The yellow are wood frame houses. And you see this whole area now is built out. And of course, what happened between 1857 and 1887 is the Civil War, which led to a population boom in DC and had a big impact, not only in Foggy Bottom, but in development throughout the city. So we have city directories. These were done annually, well, not annually, but originally done in 1820, and then at a certain point done annually. And they're sort of like phone books for people who remember phone books. And they identified addresses and individuals. And so you can click on the city directory layer, and again, it shows you 1860, and the little dots show where there's someone entered in the city directory for that area. Not much going on in 1860, a lot more in 1880, a lot more in 1900. And then you can click on the specific link for the house, and it will pop up. This is what the city directory looked like. And they're actually thicker. The later ones are thicker than telephone books, but they're available at DC History Center, and they're available online around the night up till around 1920. But you can look at the city directory for this specific house, and it will tell you that Catherine F. Fitzgerald lived there in 1893. No, excuse me, this is 1900. Catherine Fitzgerald lived there. And also that it was a business with the residents next door. So that big yellow house had both a business and an individual living there. We've done, Brian has crafted his input census data from 1880 through 1910, not including 1890, because of course 1890 census has been lost. He is currently in the process of doing 1920 through 1950, so we're really looking forward to adding that. But this shows 1900, and I mentioned the Irish immigrants in the neighborhood, and so many of them worked at the gas plant that the priest from St. Stephen's Church, which is still here, although in a new building around the corner, would be there at payday and would collect donations from the workers as they were picked up their money and walked out the door before they made it to any of those Irish bars in the neighborhood. The map here shows the Irish in green. So the little green dots are Irish households. They're white dots for white but non-Irish households, and black for African-American households. And you see this here with this concentration and this concentration of African Americans. These are the alleys, but otherwise, I think it's striking that throughout the area, it's relatively integrated. I mean, you've got this block that has both white, black, and Irish people all living together pretty much. The segregation came, but it came a little later to this neighborhood. And so then you can, again, click on the specific house. And we're looking at the Fitzgerald house. Oops. And if you can click it, that will give you some basic census data. And it shows that in 1900, Catherine Fitzgerald lived there, but she was a widow. She had two children, James and Mary. She operated a grocery store at that residence. She was assisted by a 15-year-old Irish nurse, Nellie Deedy. And then using Ancestry and other information, we were able to track down Nellie, who later worked at Columbia Hospital for Women and then worked at Tudor House in Georgetown. So you can find out a lot looking at the census information, but that's really a gateway to look at other things as well. Just a side note here, the last thing we have on the map are click points that have certain photos. And I mentioned the Washington Gas Works, and this is the gas works looking down Virginia Avenue. These are smokestacks, but this straight thing to the left is actually the Washington Monument. And these are the gas tanks that were along Virginia Avenue, where now is Potomac Plaza. So again, that's what the industrial neighborhood looked like. So we can find some things by looking at the layers about the neighborhood and some things about the specific houses as well, but we want to go in depth into the specific houses. And there's two ways of reaching each house. One is clicking on the map and then on more info. And the other is another page we have that lists all the 270 house houses and history on all of them. And the Foggy Bottom Historic District period of interest is really 1870 through 1915, when the immigrants were there. But we thought that that period, or that the interest in the neighborhood continues at any rate, continues through 1940s and 50s when it's primarily African American, through the development period, through the current day, where there are a lot of residents, but there are also a lot of George Washington University students who live here, State Department people. And so we thought if we were going to do this was Denise's idea, that we wouldn't just look at the history, we'd look at the ongoing development of the neighborhood and what it looks like today. So you can click on the little view button with any of these houses, and it comes up with a house history page. And there are 270 of these. Each of them include the current facade, so you can see what it looked like in case people want to make changes in it. And we need to call the Historic Preservation Office about them. We also have history, ownership, recollections of house documents, photos, and source materials. So this is the Fitzgerald house that we've been talking about, this large yellow brick house. So looking here, we have it in a little more detail. This is what it looks like today. And you note the architectural detail in the pressed brick along the windows and the arches and the work along the roof. We have a brief summary of its history that also talk about the architecture, when it was built, an overview of its use. And then we have the resident owner section that sort of brings all this together, the information from the history map, and then the information that we've gotten from looking at newspapers, from looking at Ancestry.com, from looking at a number of different sources. And so we find that James Fitzgerald was an Irish immigrant. He moved into the house in 1892. Shortly thereafter, he married a 25-year-old Irish immigrant who was named Kate Keller with a K, although she changed her name to Catherine with a C, because I guess that was more respectable for married ladies. They got married at St. Stephen's Church, and they had 2 kids. And they opened a grocery store. And then in 1899, excuse me, James passes away, and we don't know why yet. Everything you find out leads you to new questions. So that's one thing we'd like to find out, but we don't know. But he left a widow and 2 small children. And that's why she had the nurse there, Nellie, living with her, because obviously she needed help running the grocery store and raising the 2 kids by herself. James is buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery, which is over by Catholic University. It's not in the neighborhood, but it's where many of DC's Irish residents were buried. So in the 1900 census, we learned that Kate, now known as Catherine, still maintained the grocery store with Nellie Deedy. Then later, she remarried. About 1912, she became Catherine Kelly. And we know this by looking through the city directory information online. And she continued to operate the grocery store till 1916. After that, her family continued to own it until 1958, but the grocery store was operated by a series of other folks, mostly of Jewish descent, which is a big thing in DC too. That's another thing we want to take a closer look at, but a lot of these corner groceries were operated by Jewish folks, Gladstone Schul, Nathan Book, Isadora Pernut, Samuel and Ida Chernikoff, Nathan Book, all operated the grocery store there until the 1950s, when the last operator was a man named Jesse Silva, who lived there with his family. Jesse was an Asian American who was Japanese descent and born in Hawaii. So the neighborhood did have more variety than you might think. Then in the 50s, it was developed, it was brought by developers, it was turned into apartments. But for many years, the resident who lived there was a man named Steve Timlin, who was sort of a neighborhood historian. He didn't have access to the internet back in the 80s like we did, so we had to recreate stuff. But he was very well known in the neighborhood and is still well remembered. And so we've captured the history not just through 1915, but basically through the current day. And then we have recollections. We have a quote from Steve about the neighborhood. We have a list of source materials, recorder of deeds, our own walking tour, Boyd's directories, city directories, census. and online sources we're able to find. And where we have links, we add the links. So you can go right back and find the original sources, which is kind of cool, I think. We have an area here where we can upload documents. And so here we have a story about Steve from the GW newspaper. We have his obituary and another story about him. We have the property records that show when he bought it. We have the census showing when Silwa, the Japanese American grocery store owner, operator, worked there. And we have, probably can't see it, but we have the Chernikoffs when they lived there and operated the grocery store and lived with their daughter Esther, who was a seamstress. And then finally, last thing we have on the page are photos. We have up to 10 photos on each page. Again, showing the house here from a couple of different angles. This is the neighbors, including Steve. Denise mentioned Arts in Foggy Bottom. It's a thing the Foggy Bottom Association does every 2 years. Where artists set up works in the neighborhood, some of which are still here, but this was a display set up there. And then this is James Fitzgerald's tombstone in Mount Olivet Cemetery. So that's one house, but we mentioned there's also other houses that have other stories, and the Fitzgerald house that I showed you has a lot more detail than most of them, but we're filling them in slowly, and it's also available if you want to do house research. You can do it, and here's a place where you can publish it and make it available to everybody. But Denise is going to tell you about a house a block away from the Fitzgerald house, several houses that are along I Street in the 2500 block.
Thank you, Frank. Yes, when Frank was showing earlier the map that showed the integration of Irish, African American, and white families, I noticed that this street, the 2500 block of I Street, it seemed to be a contiguous line of Black-owned, Black-occupied dwellings that were sort of different from some of the other streets. So this was sort of more similar to what the alley dwellings were in their composition of the residents. But what I want to talk about is sort of three houses, 25, 18, 20, and then what was the other one?
2512.
2512. Another way that we found that we gathered history would be that from the people who live here. When we first started the project and people realized that we were trying to look for history of occupants in the houses, what came to the forefront was a neighbor who mentioned that a while ago she was out in her yard on the street and a woman was passing by and decided to have a conversation, and the woman was explaining that, oh, she used to live here. And they had a conversation about this, and there was some back and forth. And the woman, who we believe it was Dorothy Carmichael, she lived here on this street as a child. And she then was able to send the neighbors some family information about when her family lived here around the 1920s. So it was the Carmichael family. They occupied sort of three houses, or actually one house, but then there were other two related houses, and they were all very close. Eleonora in the photo is in the left, and that's her dad in the middle. And then her husband, Alonzo, is on the right. Now, Eleonora seems to be, was quite a force to tend with in the neighborhood. Everyone knew her. She seemed to be the caretaker from some of the children that lived nearby. One of them being who we know it was, his name was William or Bill Miner. He's the chap down in the lower picture, all dressed up with the what looks like what it is what it looks like is in the background are three houses that were at the time wood structures across the street from their house on I Street. So they're interesting to look at as well as he is, but in the sense that the elevation, how one would get into those houses, it's all quite different now. It's been all regraded, I think, because of the freeway. But Will Miner was very, very good friends with Eleanor Carmichael's granddaughter, who was living there with them at the time. And we know that Eleanor lived at 2512. She was a charwoman, meaning she was, the general meaning that she was hired to do general cleaning in a large building. Her granddaughter, her husband, Alonzo, he was an elevator operator at the Smithsonian Arts and Industries building, then known as the National Museum. And they were from Mississippi. The neighbor, he lived at both houses, let's see, 2518 and 2520. And for some reason that we haven't been able to determine, he was raised by Eleonora. And then the granddaughter, Dorothy, they were playmates, as I said, but in 1950, Dorothy was 10 years old and Bill was just 6 months younger, I think. We know that Dorothy went to the now demolished Briggs Elementary School. And I'm assuming that probably Bill was there as well. We know that Dorothy Carmichael, she went on to work at the department store, Saks Jandel, and then for quite some time at the National Science Foundation. So I think what's interesting about Eleonora, as we've come to learn about a lot of the alley housing, as Frank explained a little bit when he was talking, is about the closeness of these neighborhoods. And there was a lot of looking out for each other, looking out for each other's children and families. They may have all had individual doors to these houses, but in some way, the doors were always open. And for the most part, people were very welcoming of each other and helped each other whenever they could. I wanted to say, the only other thing I wanted to say is that the history of the houses still continues. You know, we are still trying to learn more about the Carmichaels and some of the families who lived there since then and maybe before then. And also to today, on that one block, 2500 block of I Street, it's a combination of owner occupied, owners who rent to students, and some might be Airbnbs, we're not sure. But that's still part of the history that we want to keep capturing as we record the house in the time, not just in the past. So Frank will
Yeah, so
explain next.
just the last thing is, you know, as I mentioned, we're open to anyone contributing. If you know anything about the Foggy Bottom neighborhood or lived here or know somebody, that's great. Obviously, we'd love to hear firsthand recollections, but also if you're just interested in learning about the history of the city and want some resources to drill down in an area or even a specific house and share that information and then share that information publicly, you're welcome to do that. So I think we're going to post our website in the chat and answer any questions.
I did also want to add, like with the Carmichaels, I mean, history can be found anywhere. It's not always through research. It can be as casual as a conversation with someone who may recall someone who met someone. And when we have been out and about at like the DC History Center, the network events, it's interesting how many people do have some recollection of this neighborhood in the city, had someone who lived here or they lived here themselves. And I think too, for Foggy Bottom, everything that Frank shared, it's now a tiny neighborhood, but how integral it really was to the development of the city in general. It packed a lot of punch for its small space on the map, but it really was instrumental in moving the city ahead and becoming more modern. And there's a lot to learn.
So here's my email, and here's our website as well. So we'd be happy to answer any questions or hear any comments.
Yes, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box or in the chat. I'll look at both. So we have one about the national, they're asking who's planning to do something with the freeway. So if you have any comments on the National Capital Planning Commission.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's I mentioned my blog site Funkstown. There are a couple of posts I've done on this issue. The NCPC hired a consulting firm to take a look at this whole area around the Kennedy Center, Constitution Avenue to the Roosevelt Bridge, the highway area in our neighborhood, and reimagine it. And so there would be some of the ramps would be removed, some of them would be decked over. There would be circles placed sort of where Constitution Avenue meets Roosevelt Bridge. So it's not just a flyover there, it's more of a monumental thing. And then part of the plan is they're running out of room on the mall. Um, and there is space off of East Street in for example, Walt Whitman Park, for example, where you could do more monuments, but you get there coming out of a tunnel. So it would be creating another monumental entrance to DC, a proper monumental entrance to the Kennedy Center, replacing the highways that are between the historic district and the river, perhaps with apartment buildings to provide some housing as well. And it would be a big project, and they seem excited about it. But as I said, about 20 years ago, they had a similar project for decking over the freeway and connecting the Kennedy Center, and it just didn't go anywhere because it will take a lot of infrastructure money that we don't have yet.
And I think too, I can add that, the area around where the freeways are, there's sort of this disconnect between neighborhoods, between the Georgetown waterfront, the West End section of the city, Foggy Bottom, and then going even further up to sort of the Foggy Bottom metro station. And this issue of how does one get around, right now it's a very, very circuitous route. But opening up that area so the neighborhoods can flow freely between each other without having, families with strollers and bikers and all sorts of pedestrian travel go so far out of their way to get to what's just right around the corner. There's a huge opportunity, I think, for connecting these neighborhoods in a city in a more logical way that can also share the history of that particular part of Foggy Bottom and really provide for more commercial retail opportunities and make it more of a vibrant as the Washington waterfront area could be. But it all takes money and time and planning. So
Yes. Yeah, we had another question about other plans for the Kennedy Center not being brought to fruition, and I assume that that's also budget related.
Yeah, yeah. Originally, the Kennedy Center built the reach along the river for performance rehearsal space and all that. Originally, the idea was to have that out in front of the Kennedy Center on a deck over the freeway, which would have been a lot better, but that didn't happen.
Yeah.
There are a lot of plans for the Kennedy Center is wonderful, but there have been additional plans to make it more wonderful that haven't reached fruition yet.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is money and part of it is also land ownership in that particular area. Some of it's parkland, some of it's federal, some of it's city, and that need I say more in terms of complicating how a decision might be arrived at.
Yes, and DC, it is an estate, so there's always different complications in terms of land usage as well.
Sure.
We have a question. Do you think that the Foggy Bottom Historic District could be expanded to include a larger area?
No. Historic districts need to be pretty contiguous. And there are three little houses. If you've ever been in the neighborhood, there are three little houses by the gas station right at Virginia Avenue at 27th. And originally it was proposed that those houses, which go back to 1870 and 1880, be included in the historic district, but there's a highway in between. So they wouldn't go for that. There is in the neighborhood more generally the George Washington University Old West End Historic District, which includes the campus, and there are also some landmark buildings around there. But I think our borders of our little district are, God, we'd have to redo the map. It would just be
Yeah, and the whole history project,
it would
think of that.
it would be
It
too
would
hard.
just be so much work.
Right.
You know,
Kidding.
I wanted to say about the area that was redeveloped for the freeways, that the churches and the houses were there that at the time, many of them had already been refurbished.
Mm.
They had been remodeled and brought up to grade, up to fine living quality. And the school, there was some, I don't know about the enrollment and how it changed over years
Of course.
specifically, but it was not a abandoned area, right, for this type of use. I mean, a considerable number of people were incredibly inconvenienced, and without alternative dwellings to then move to. So it does make that part of the Foggy Bottom area something that it's important to try to identify its history, the people who live there and contributed to the community. Even more important to try to reconstruct, in our opinion.
Yep.
Definitely, and we love our historic districts in DC particularly. We have so many historic districts, but there are other preservation is in place with other properties that exist outside of historic districts. So, okay, we have another question. Topographically, the Foggy Bottom neighborhood seems to sit on a bit of a bluff overlooking the lower river bottom basin the Kennedy Center is now in. Is that correct? Or do you want to describe
Ooh.
where it is elevation wise, if you
Geology.
can?
Yeah, well, it's changed over time. I mean, where the Kennedy Center sits used to be actually much higher. There's Braddock Rock was I did a Funkstown on it. It's a long story, but there's right in front of the Peace Center or Peace Institute off of Constitution Avenue and the ramp to the Roosevelt Bridge, there's a well, and you can look down the well, and there's a rock, which used to be Braddock's Rock, which used to be much, much bigger before they dynamited it and used it to build the Capitol. So that was kind of a bluff there at the time, but there's been a lot of regrading in the area.
And you can see some of the regrading in that one photograph of 25th Street, the 2500 block of it, with the houses requiring, 12 steps to just get up to entry level. That has all been regraded. And I don't know what time period that happened, probably during the freeways.
No, it's earlier. It was the 1870s.
Oh, it was.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. There was a lot of regrading in the city for sewer lines, and so you find, and the result of it was some people, their front steps were now 12 feet above the street, and they weren't happy about it. But that's an interesting story. But that's another story.
We've had a lot of people submitting their experiences living in Foggy Bottom or their parents, things like that. What would be the best way for them to share that with you, or if there are other people who watch this webinar and would like to share their Foggy Bottom history with you, what would be the
Well, we'd
best
love
way?
that. We'd really love that. I think probably the easiest thing is just send me an email. It's FLEONEDC@gmail.com. It's on the screen. That's probably the easiest thing, and then we'd be happy to get whatever information you have and talk more with you about it. And then you can write something up for the blog post or for the map, or we're happy to do it, or maybe you just want to share it and don't want it broadly. But yeah, we would love that. That would be very exciting for us.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. And we've had another question around some of the photos and other resources that you've used. Were those primarily from the DC History Center collections, or did you use other resources as well?
Yeah, a lot of some of them were, for example, from some of them are from DC History. A number of them were from George Washington University, Gelman Library Special Collections. Some of the a good deal of the Foggy Bottom history, for example, the Foggy Bottom news issues that we talked about were maintained at Gelman, and then we actually got a grant to digitize them, but then the university did it themselves, and we didn't even have to pay for it, so that was wonderful. So that's been a big source. Washingtoniana collection at the People's Archives, DC Public Library is a place. A lot of newspapers, especially the Evening Star, which you can get through the DC Library online. Sometimes the photos aren't very good there, but sometimes they are. So those are kind of, and Ancestry.com, I guess, but we haven't found that much there yet, but that's another place to look.
And I think on the house histories, we are slowly getting more information from owners or previous owners or things they might have inherited when they moved in. So if you were to look through some of the individual houses and their histories, we're able to show, interior shots or family shots, shots of renovations or just recollections. So we've been able to enhance individual house histories by neighborhood participation. And from people who recall their aunt lived here or things of that nature. So that's another resource we depend on.
Yep. Also online at the Library of Congress. There's a bunch of great stuff there.
Great. I think we have time for one more question that I'll ask you, which is what's next for the History Project, and do you have plans for any other events or exhibitions in the future?
Well, we have our online walking tour, and we also do in-person walking tours. Last fall we did 3 of them. We might do one in the spring. We'll probably do at least one in the fall. We're continuing to add new information to the house history map and the individual house history pages. We have quite a backlog of stuff to add, although we're always happy to get new information. We do Funkstown every 2 weeks, so you can read that. And then we might have some another major project for next year, but we'll see.
Great. Well, keeping us in suspense. I love it. Can't wait to see what you all do. This is such an amazing project. And I'm glad that we've been able to share it with so many people. So for those who are attending, if you have additional questions, you can email them to me or to Frank, and we'll help you out. I'll send an email out with the recording of this webinar, which will go on YouTube probably within a day or two. And I'll also send along all of the resources that were mentioned in this webinar, including History Quest, the History Project, and all of the different ways that you can get connected to this project. But thank you again, Frank and Denise. I'm so glad that we could do this today. And I look forward to seeing you soon. I'm sure I'll see you at the DC History Conference, which everybody should go to in the spring, in April this year. But we will all be there. So
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're really happy that DC Preservation League is focusing on neighborhoods this month, and thanks so much for including us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Yeah, thank you for
yes,
listening.
thank you everybody for
shared
attending.
a lot of history.
All right.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. All right. Have a great day, everybody.
Yep, you too.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.